Thanks everyone for joining us on your lunch hour. I'm very excited to be part of this fabulous group. I'm going to start us off by talking to you a little bit about carbon, specifically what is carbon. Carbon is a greenhouse gas. You should know that it occurs naturally as a result of human activities. The other greenhouse gases are water vapor, methane, nitrous oxide, fluorinated gases, but carbon roughly makes up about 75% of emissions from greenhouse gases. And for this reason, all other emissions are typically normalized to carbon units. And you'll see that written as CO2e. So why are we talking about carbon? Next slide. So as you mentioned, carbon also occurs as a result of human activities. So this is one of my favorite graphics depicting the problem. So if you can think about it as sort of filling a bathtub with water, the size of the faucet and the drain are misaligned, and the tub will continue to overflow and fill. At the time of this graphic, about 4/5 of carbon emissions actually came from burning fossil fuels, and then deforestation and land use changes ended up being a little bit further behind, but all of those uses and emissions that come from burning fossil fuels, deforestation, and land use changes are sort of overpowering Earth's natural sinks. And then another way of looking at that, if you want to go to the next slide, this is showing the emissions and the sinks. So the larger arrow on the left are the emissions from fossil fuels, and then the natural sinks are things like the ocean, the soil, the earth, and a lot of those things will capture the carbon and store it, but the natural sinks can't really keep up, and so this remains a significant amount of CO2 emissions within the atmosphere. And the next slide. Why architecture, engineering, and construction? Buildings and their operations contribute a significant percentage to global energy-related CO2 emissions, and nearly half of the CO2 emissions come from the building industry. So this is why we're talking about it. I'm going to go to the next slide. So generally speaking, with buildings in the construction industry, we talk about two different types of emissions: operational and embodied carbon. The operational emissions are associated with energy used to operate the buildings, and that's the little yellow bit of this long graph here. And then the rest is embodied carbon, and these are the emissions associated with materials and construction processes over the life of the building. So these are the things that we're going to be talking to you about today. Next slide. And then I'm here to tell you a little bit about the Carbon Leadership Forum. It's a group of researchers that educate and foster cross-collaboration, and the aim is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions used in the building and the infrastructure related. It's a nonprofit organization based out of Seattle, where their full-time staff is located. And then there are hubs of other industry professionals all over the country, of which I'm a part of the CLF Boston Northeast Hub. The CLF National, which is in Seattle, has tons of great resources that have like impact reports, baselines for building materials and buildings and materials. And then the Boston Hub has 5 working groups. There's a policy and advocacy group, and they have been tracking policy and carbon-related bills in the Northeast. We often talk a little bit about what's going on around the country and how we can help other more local related bills and move forward based on things that we've seen pass in other states. There's a project timeline group, and what they're doing is working on a timeline for implementation of embodied carbon strategies or embodied carbon reduction strategies for all design phases. We've got a pretty active reuse group, and they last year created a reuse roadmap, which is a fantastic document that talks about how we can begin to reuse buildings and materials within the built environment. And then there's a concrete working group that does 2 things. They are working on putting out specifications for low embodied carbon concrete. And then this year, they're actually helping to coordinate a grant that is hoping to accelerate the use of low embodied carbon concrete in the Northeast specifically. Then lastly, there's an education group of which I'm the co-chair, and we're collecting case studies and helping with educational materials for teaching people how to implement low embodied carbon concrete strategies on their projects. We also partner with a lot of other folks, MEP 2040, which you'll hear about today, SC 2050, and then the AIA 2030 commitment. These are all commitments that groups have made to lowering the carbon associated with the building industry. And then we're also part of the Boston Society of Architects. So that's what the Carbon Leadership Forum is.
Thanks so much, Suni. That was a great summary. And now I'm going to turn it over to Kayleigh to talk about MEP 2040.
Thanks so much. So MEP 2040 is a commitment specific to all systems engineers, and lighting is in that funny space, right, between architecture and systems engineering. So really finding a home for lighting, and MEP 2040, I would think, would be part of that scope. So we launched this commitment in 2021 in October, made it public, but this steering committee that you see on this slide worked together really hard to get together the tenets of the challenge, which I'll describe a little bit more of. But right now we have 63 signatory firms. They have to be firms that have MEP scope as part of their services, and then 31 different supporting organizations. So architects, manufacturers, clients fall into that kind of supporting space. So if you go to the next slide. So the primary challenge here is for all systems engineers to advocate for and achieve net zero carbon in their projects, with operational by 2030 and embodied carbon by 2040. We know that those are very ambitious targets. If you remember that graph that Suni just presented, there was a 28% building operations responsibility there. Lighting falls into that category with the energy use of lights in our buildings. Other things like gas or refrigerants for systems also fall into that. And then the other 11% being the kind of materiality of our buildings. So we have commitments against both of those with specific targets. But some of the tenets of this challenge are to establish a company plan. We're not checking those plans, but we're giving advice. So we had a forum specifically dedicated to going over the responsibilities in the company plan and showing some examples of what good looks like in that space right now. Another one of the tenets of the challenge is to request low GWP refrigerants, which refrigerants have an enormous responsibility. There is a citation in the Kayleigh Amendment, which was recently signed by the US, that 0.5 degrees Celsius, everybody's trying to get to the 1.5 reduction, right? 0.5 is solely due to refrigerants over a 100-year period. So it's a huge chunk of carbon that we know we can definitely do something about today. So that was one of the 4 tenets in and of itself. A third being to request environmental product declarations. We're going to talk about that a lot today in terms of how lighting manufacturers can get on board with producing EPDs for us so that we know how much embodied carbon each of those products takes up. And then the 4th tenet just being to be a part of the community, join the forums, join our working groups. We have working groups dedicated to data analysis and reporting, manufacturers and EPDs, communications, and then partnerships. You can go to the next slide. So just to show, again, those inclusions, we've got mechanical, electrical, plumbing, fire protection, lighting, fire alarm, AVIT. I probably missed a couple of acronyms in there against other inclusions under the systems side of things, but really looking at the operational carbon. So the building EUI by fuel type, refrigerant quantities and leakages, and then all of the embodied carbon facets of all that materiality of that system's scope. So equipment, fixtures, routing. And then some of our goals for 2023 are to start reporting refrigerant leakage because it is a major source of global warming, and also to prompt creation of more MEP environmental product declarations. It's a hole that we have. Also, we had a nice shout out in the White House press release. I think it was 2 months ago, but nice to see that's being recognized kind of at a more global level. Next slide. Just a couple of resources available. So we do have some templates on the site that you'll see against things like asking for EPDs so that you have a template to be able to send to manufacturers and just some language to help you out. So you can always go there and find a few resources on MEP2040.org. And then we also have a refrigerant impact calculator at refrigerarantimpact.org. And then also, you are welcome to join for a quarterly forum if you want to go to, next slide, sorry, MEP2040.org. You'll find all of our previous quarterly forums recorded there, in addition to the upcoming ones that you can join. So the last quarterly forum was dedicated to manufacturers. We had manufacturers come and talk about their process of creating EPDs. So I imagine that would be useful to each of you. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Now I'm going to turn it over to Kate to talk a little bit about the work that she's doing at PNNL.
Great. I think you can just skip through the first two. They're kind of extras. Yeah. Yeah. Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me on today. I just have a couple slides, and the first one I'm not going to dwell on very long. It's just more like, I guess if you have access to this later, maybe a handy reference. But this is my kind of table summary that I put together, sort of thinking about comparisons between, LCAs and EPDs and TM65. But I just wanted to note that I have been participating in two of the ASHRAE working groups. So one of them is developing the TM65 North American addendum, so that this table is, or timeline, I guess, rather, in the blue and the green there is from the ASHRAE website. So the goal is to have that North American addendum out by August. And then also working on the whole life carbon guide for building systems with the goal of that being out in October. So those are two potential resources to just keep your eye out for. You could skip to the next slide. Yeah, and we've been working on this LCA related project for, I guess, about a year and a half. And I think the relevant part for today is, we've been looking at this gap. I mean, it's MEP gap, yes, like there are actually lots of MEP EPDs, but maybe not so much for some of the really intensive products, like what Kayleigh was talking about, not too many EPDs out for products that are, like chillers and other products that have refrigerants or other types of HVAC systems. And also generally, I come from a lighting background, and we've been looking at lighting, and there's only a handful of lighting products that have EPDs. And so we have been working over the last year and a half with some manufacturers, both lighting manufacturers and driver manufacturers, to gather data on those luminaires and the overall process, to kind of identify specifically for the lighting industry and other electrical products, what are some of the barriers that are preventing these manufacturers from getting EPDs. And there's a handful of them, from just the complexity of the process to, cost and resources required. And so we've been trying to, identify those barriers and then address what we can. And so through that process, we've created, it's like a life cycle inventory template. So, an LCA template that aligns with the ISO standardized rules that lay out the requirements for how to do a life cycle assessment, depending on what the type of product is. And so this template aligns with those guidelines and also other North American requirements and background data, kind of pulls in, gives some standardization around, how we can think about the grid mix for North America, and generally trying to standardize some of the background data that goes into this life cycle assessment process to just improve comparability. And so this is, we're kind of thinking of this as a case study, looking at the lighting industry, but then also expanding that to MEP products and batteries as well. And so where we're at right now is we have a template in place that's being tested out, and we're still looking for people to join this next phase. You could go to the next slide. There is we're kind of launching a test period where we're looking for manufacturers who would want to try it out. So we're kind of expanding the use in the beta phase of this template. But ultimately, when the real sort of version 1 gets released, hopefully that'll be in the fall. We're aiming for September. Right now, we'll see, how close we get to that, but aiming for the fall release of that template. That would be something that lighting manufacturers could use if they wanted to hopefully, streamline that process of collecting the data that's necessary in a format that's familiar, hopefully, to LCA practitioners in order to get EPDs. Yeah, so that's the idea. Kind of trying to find ways to reduce the time and effort required to gather the data, and we're sort of through the work that we're doing with the driver manufacturers, trying to collect other primary data bits that go into the LCA, so that some if they're where some manufacturers have come and run into problems trying to collect data on drivers, right? That might be really difficult to collect data on. So we're doing some of that data collection now to get that information, and we're looking to identify where there might be other sort of primary data bits that we need to gather that are kind of specific for the lighting industry. Yeah, I think that's all my slides. So thank you.
Thank you, Kate. Now, Leela, I'm interested to hear what you're doing with the GreenLight Alliance.
Thanks, Alexandra, and thanks for having me alongside all of these inspiring panelists, all of whom I'm working with. So that's really fun, and also nice to see so many familiar faces who have joined on the call too. So the GreenLight Alliance is a network of lighting practitioners from every sector of the industry, whether that's manufacturing, design, industry associations, press, and it does have a global outlook. My contacts are on the next slide if anyone's curious, but the reason Alexandra's invited me to speak today is largely because of the life cycle assessment incubator, which we are running as a pilot collective case study effectively. The next slide shows you the basic overview of what we embarked on in March last year, and we will be sharing a lot more detail about what's come of this in June. But in its most basic form, we are actually actively getting data from a number of manufacturers on their specific luminaires that are in the market, and then spinning that through life cycle assessment frameworks to actually give us some unbranded data in the form of 5 industry environmental product declarations for some workhorse architectural fixtures. And that's all really based on us trying to get a sense of where we're at present. So it's really just about measuring the status quo, and it's preliminary to us then seeing what that means for us as an industry, trying to decide on what is best practice, what should become code. But for the moment, we've really been collaborating as practitioners. So myself as a lighting designer, I know how much we really need to save time and money in upskilling on all of this. So just quickly, the 3 main goals are, the next slide shows you that primarily we wanted to make sure that there was a really constructive ecosystem of people who really want this work to move, and not to necessarily have to wait for government to force us to learn in this area. So we wanted to have designers and manufacturers working side by side. The second goal was global harmonization, to the fact that we need to make this process as easy as possible. We really would like to see a single approach evolving, so that as a designer, I don't have to actually learn multiple different standards in different territories around the world, and manufacturers don't have to invest in complying with multiple different systems around the world. The third goal is basically getting as much data as we can to help bridge the data gap as we recognize exists. So just quickly looking at where we're at in relation to each of those 3 goals. The next slide shows you that we have, actually it's gone up now, it's 28 manufacturers participating and designers from 64 firms. The next slide shows you that that's over 200 individuals putting their minds to this, which is really exciting. And that means then on the next slide that we actually can start to get the best ideas filtering through from around the world. So this map just shows you that idea of global harmonization and transparency for what's happening in different parts of the world is very much true. We see that manufacturers are largely represented across Europe and North America, and that we have designers from every continent. So where are we in terms of goal 3? The next slide shows you the 5 different types of products that we're seeking to create an industry average on. So you'll see that there's a downlight, pendant cylinder, pendant linear, 2x2 troffer, as we call in North America, and then a pedestrian pole. So if these slides are shared later, there's a bit more detail on the specific performance criteria for each of those, but it's a starting point for us to look at the potential impact of cradle to grave analysis of each of these products. Just in the final closing of my introduction, I wanted to share a little bit about how this will be applied and is being applied. Many of you will be familiar with the embodied carbon credits that you can get through LEED. So with these industry average EPDs and product specific EPDs, which some manufacturers have already embarked on and some are starting to, we'll be able to, as lighting designers, contribute to this tally of products being used on projects, that we can say that we do have EPDs available. And we have started at Borealis Lighting Studio to incorporate this into our actual projects by changing our spec sections and our fixture schedules. So the next 2 slides are just a quick summary of the fact that we have already updated our spec sections to require and to request information on both embodied carbon and material ingredients transparency, and included information about how we can help to extend the maintenance and life cycle of the products that we select. And the fixture schedule on the final slide is another example of how we have added actual metric columns requiring global warming potential to be reported, and notes about it complying with LEED, and descriptions about when we are asking for it. So it's not on every luminaire, but we are being very selective about which ones make sense. So yeah, thanks.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to stop sharing now, and we're going to move into the more roundtable portion of our discussion. So we've heard a lot today about environmental product declarations and why we would be asking for those. So I'd love to talk a little bit with our panelists about what you see as the biggest barrier for manufacturers when it comes to getting EPDs in general, and more specific for lighting products. So Kayleigh, I'm going to start with you, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Sure. I think there's a slightly different challenge for MEP in particular, interiors as well. I would group into that kind of, you have lots of different products that don't necessarily take up a lot of mass in your building, and there's a lot of variation. There are lots of manufacturers that accommodate each of those needs individually, and manufacturers have very large product catalogs. So I think it's slightly different to getting together like a sector or product concrete EPD. That's not what we're facing. It's not like we're focusing on 3 primary materials. There's so many materials that could potentially be covered. So if you're thinking about lighting products, you could spec from several different manufacturers with very long product lines. So I think it's a little bit more daunting for manufacturers in lighting in particular to be able to start the EPD process. But from what I know of working with someone like Josh Jacobs from WAB Sustainability, is that it's much cheaper actually to do a full product line than it is to do it's not the cost multiplied by every product. So I think it might be a cost barrier, might be the time that it takes. It sometimes takes a couple of years to get an EPD out once you start the process, because they're going back and figuring out from A1 raw material extraction phase how much embodied carbon there is. Sorry if that was a long-winded answer, but I think it's multifaceted, I guess, to summarize.
No, I think that's a great answer. Suni, what are your thoughts on this?
Hard to add. You had so many of those things there. And I think this idea that there's so many products and product lines really sort of hits at the heart. But I also think that lighting products specifically are made up of a bunch of components, and those components are also really complicated. And so for manufacturers to understand like where all of these components come from and how to get all of that data, that seems to be like a pretty difficult thing that we've seen, at least on the architecture side, in terms of understanding all of the components that go into things. I'm just gonna stick with that one.
Now, Leela, you've been doing a lot of work through the GreenLight Alliance to generate these EPDs. Have you found any specific barriers during that process?
I think the biggest hurdle when we started was just to define what it is that we're measuring. So, and I think that goes back to the points that have already been made by Kayleigh and Suni about economies of scale and the need to address the complexity of the products that we're creating. So it's not concrete with a few ingredients in it where it's fairly straightforward. We have so many different options that it took us quite some time to just agree on what the average product might be. So I think that is daunting, but I think as we move forward together as a group, that we can start to have an industry best practice position on which fixtures and do we, for example, create a worst case scenario picture and focus on the highest impact version of what we're creating, or for example, a lowest common denominator and thinking about the simplest luminaire without all of the accessories, for example. I think that will develop in time naturally, but it's certainly one of the things that people are getting worried about venturing into, if it's going to mean that they're supposed to report on every single version of every single luminaire. And we're trying to say that's not necessary, which is why we focused on the highest volume products first. And that's the same approach we took with Borealis in the projects that we have started to decide which products will be required to have reporting on them.
Yeah, I really like that idea of focusing on these highest volume and just seeing what impact you can have there. So Kate, what are you seeing in your work as barriers to getting EPDs for lighting?
I guess I would say, the biggest, maybe the biggest barrier, like overall kind of umbrella, is just sort of finding the, people finding that the sort of the trustworthy source to get information, right? Or like who, finding ways that we can all kind of communicate and work together so that we can have, a one direction, right? I think that's where, we're seeing people getting kind of hung up where, it's like, I hear that one a lot, right? Where people are like, I have a lot of different products. I think that's a great question. We definitely hear that. I have this one product with so many different SKUs. So how, where do I start? And I think that there are answers out there. There's like one set of rules that says you can, you can get a EPD for a family, and if you go to the other kind of existing set of rules, it says you have to get one for each product, right? So, there's different ways that you can get EPDs done and through different pathways. And so, what's going to work, kind of identifying what can work for the lighting industry and what, who can help people have their, hold their hands through that process, right? So I think if you're a manufacturer and you got to get this information, to gather the information for an LCA, there are going to be certain barriers. And so there's ways that you can go to an LCA practitioner and they will walk you through that process, right? And kind of help you find answers. But it'd be really nice if there was a way, you know, sort of a body of information for the lighting industry that we could refer to. And I think that that is being developed very quickly right now, you know, through the work of all of these organizations that we've heard about today, you know, GreenLight Alliance and MEP 2040 and Carbon Leadership Forum are all developing resources, and P&L is also developing resources to do that. So I think, you know, yeah, I think we're all trying to address those barriers, and you know, we'll keep identifying more, right? So I think some of the biggest ones like cost, I think we're really trying to address that, and you know, reducing the you know, the initial barriers to get into the process. Like, what is my first step? You know, hopefully we can have some answers for that, and you can like join, you know, the GreenLight Alliance LCA incubator, which is like, you know, that's a way to get specific information about the lighting industry and how to get started. So yeah.
It's great. And I think, you know, we started off talking about barriers, but I think ultimately we're at a really exciting point with this, where there's a lot of opportunity and potential. And I'd really love to hear, you know, like two of you have really mentioned this, but collaboration is so important and getting everyone moving in the same direction. And given the timeframes we have, you know, doing this quickly. So Suni, I'd really like to hear from your perspective in the Carbon Leadership Forum, how can these organizations collaborate, and also how can manufacturers and specifiers who might sit at the opposite side of the table be really collaborating to move this shared goal of getting EPDs moving forward as quickly as possible?
Yeah, that's a hard one. I feel like the collaboration is key, right? And I think what Leela's doing in creating industry EPDs is probably going to be the fastest way to get that information. And then, I mean, I don't know how many times I see the same people on all of the carbon calls. And so I think that that's also pretty helpful and insightful, right? Like you see the same people working on it. And so they're all sharing information. So whether you're a manufacturer or a designer or a researcher, as long as we continue to be open and share all of the information, we'll get there more quickly.
I do think the sustainability community in lighting is really great. There's a lot of consistency, and people are always very open with sharing their best practices, which is fantastic. Kayleigh, is there anything you'd like to add when we're thinking about collaboration and MEP 2040?
I think one of the primary things, and I'm sure that Leela, you could elaborate on this process for lighting, is agreement to the product category rules. PCR is something you'll hear pretty often. So for lighting, how are we measuring it? Is it by the weight of the lights? Is it by the wattage? Is it by the cost? Just agreeing to that, or I think it would be mass or watts, but Leela, I'm curious to hear what those agreed product category rules are for lighting, because I think that actually is the first kind of like, before you do anything else, let's agree how we will kind of weight these against each other. And it becomes more complex when you deal with something that has an operational aspect as well as a kind of embodied materiality. And then also like the lifespans against each of these things, agreeing to that, and the replacement rates, because a light's not something you install once and then walk away and come back 100 years later and it's still running, right? And I think we're dealing with something a little bit more complex. But I think if we were to agree to those kind of rules of the road before collaborating or start the collaboration there, that's most helpful.
Yes, Leela, I'm going to turn that over to you. I know there's some questions in there about the specifics of how the GreenLight Alliance is doing it, but I really think what that program is a fantastic example of collaboration, and having over 200, you know, designers and manufacturers coming together and to agree on how to move this process forward is really exciting.
I think I'm excited by all the people we get to work with as well, but there are so many questions. It's as though when you start on this process, it just opens the can of worms, so to speak. And I know Kate is very much, you know, at the heart of this PCR question for North America, as you know, we're working together to try and get something that can be translatable. We started, Kayleigh, to your question, we started with the PCR or PSR for luminaires that PepsiCo Passport has, and that was designed because there was a memorandum of understanding with UL that's obviously more North American focused, and it seemed as though that could be one pathway for global application of a similar approach. That's not to say that's the only or the final way that things will continue, but with all of this work, we're just doing the best we can with what appears to be available at any point in time. That will no doubt evolve, and that is why it's so important to have as many different minds on this as possible. And that transparency question is absolutely a resourcing one, you know, to avoid duplicating the same kind of investigations so that we can move faster, since this is a question about momentum. And Kayleigh, when you were talking about lifetime, how do we actually report on lifetime? Even that has led to clarity that all of our manufacturer friends are reporting in different ways. So even when you're trying to report, you know, you're trying to move towards a functional unit that allows us to compare one fixture over another, even in getting the data to put into this average, there's a lot of different approaches, but it's all good stuff that we're working together to try and identify these aspects that need further consensus within the industry. And I would suggest that, you know, pilot 2 and pilot 3, or, you know, help with our existing industry organisations like the IES will help us get there. And so I would reiterate that having the support of these existing industry bodies is really critical, because many of us are doing this in our own time. And if we want more momentum, we sort of need as much support from different forums as possible. Yeah.
That's great. And I think, you know, we've talked here about data collection. And I think that's really the first step. Manufacturers are working towards that. We're generating EPDs. And be interested to know, Kate, you know, when do you think we'll have enough data to conduct a whole building life cycle assessment and really properly be looping in, you know, all of MEP and lighting and getting that sort of full picture?
That's a good question. I mean, yeah, it's, well, like we just did a search looking at a bunch of different databases to try to get a sense of what EPDs were out there, you know, and because we've been hearing a lot of people saying, you know, that there's this sort of MEP gap, and there is. I mean, we found over 500 EPDs for MEP equipment, and that, you know, covers, you know, a lot of those were plumbing, right? And there were very few EPDs for some products. Like we found 10 chiller EPDs. We found a few EPDs for air handling units. You know, those are specific product EPDs, and there, you know, at least 22 lighting EPDs. So, you know, there are EPDs out there. The one, you know, when Kayleigh was talking about like that functional unit, you know, any life cycle, just for anyone who isn't totally familiar with all the acronyms, you know, anyone who does a life cycle assessment, it's based off of this set of rules, the PCRs that people were mentioning. Those are the rules, the product category rules, or the product specific rules is PSR. Those rules explain how you do the LCA for a specific product. And when you create that, you have to define the functional unit. And so that's sort of a unit of effort or a unit of function that you then base the life cycle assessment on. So like one of the PSR for lighting that a lot of people are using, you know, defines light at a certain, you know, a certain amount of light over a certain amount of time. So it's defined, it has a functional unit, and then you create the life cycle assessment and the EPD based off of that functional unit. And so there are, you know, you're not really, you shouldn't really compare an EPD with an EPD. It's not easy to just substitute one. Like if you find one chiller EPD, it might have a different functional unit, you know, than the one that you want to put in the building. So you can't just kind of take like any existing EPD and say, well, this will do, like this will get me, you know, it might give you some information, right? But there still is, so while there are some EPDs out there for some of these MEP products, there needs to be a lot more, and there needs to be more comparability. I think that whole LCA process, like it is a standardized third-party assessed process that is incredible, really. I mean, it's like an art form and a science, and it's like this amazing process, but there's still room for improvement. We're trying to do that, and I think we can see more and better, higher quality EPDs going out into the market. I don't know. My guess would be, to really answer your question, I think it would be at least like years, right, before we'd get enough products to be able to kind of easily do a whole building assessment. But I think it is really, there's a lot happening right now. I think that we're going to start seeing a flood of lighting EPDs out there. There's the industry average, all of those products, that are contributing towards that industry average, that are participating in that GreenLight Alliance. They've collected a lot of data, right, to get the industry average. So it's not a huge leap to then go get a product level EPD. And, we've been working with luminaire manufacturers to get the data collected. So I think that we're going to see a lot of EPDs out there for lighting and also for these other products. I think it won't be a long time, but it'll be years. Yeah.
Well, I'm excited for that flood of EPDs that you see on the horizon. That's really
Flood.
here. And so, Leela, what does this sort of timeline look like from your perspective? I know there's a designer portion and a manufacturer portion. So how does that, tie into designers really being able to look at the whole building impacts?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think in terms of when we will be able to make decisions between different products, in some ways it's already here, to the extent that there are at least some products that have life cycle assessment information available, and we have relationships with particular manufacturers who we know are really committed to making positive change. And I think it's almost more about the relationships that we are moving forward with, as opposed to all of the data. So I think how soon? It will be just as soon as we have enough projects that we have gently moved on thinking that there's a commercial business case for actually getting the reporting completed. That's if we're moving just as a single designer, single manufacturer on single project scenario. But what would be better is obviously to have some industry support to get more of the industry averages, which seem to be effectively more affordable for manufacturers to participate in, and perhaps more constructive in terms of getting groups of data to feed into all of these databases that life cycle assessment is pulling from.
I think, Suni, to switch this question over to you, from the Carbon Leadership Forum, you've been focusing on other material categories, but I think there's a lot that the different industries can learn from each other, from the roadmaps other product categories have taken. So I'd be interested to know, your thoughts on that and how you've maybe seen that play out on some things that you've been focused on.
I mean, I think so much of what Kayleigh and Kayleigh have talked about in terms of establishing the product category rules and trying to understand what you're analyzing is huge. And I mean, the AIA materials letter went out a long time ago. So it's taken a long time to get to where we are today with products. And to be honest, I don't think, I mean, we don't even have all of the products and manufacturers on board with providing EPDs in just the general architectural products. So I think it's going to take a lot. I think the benefit that we have now is that there's momentum from the architecture products, and we've sort of learned from some of those. MEP items are, again, incredibly component driven. So it does take a lot more data and research to figure that out. But I think I think it's interesting because we know some of the major material contributors to embodied carbon, right? Like aluminum's one of them. So if we just start to think about how to optimize our products, that might be the sort of next step to do this, like in tandem, right? Like thinking about the materials that we know have low embodied carbon, and how do we sub those out for things that we know have high embodied carbon. And even though we're not getting all of the data and not having all of the EPDs, we know that we're at least doing something good. So I'm sort of optimistic that people can start to optimize before we've even really reached transparency. But I don't know how that helps us with full LCAs.
So it sounds like this is still a little bit on the horizon, but we're making really exciting progress. And Kayleigh, do you have anything you want to add to that discussion through the MVP 2040 work?
Sure, I had a couple of notes just as people were talking. So through a tool like OneClick, you could perform a whole building LCA if you wanted to. However, the products that are given there, and as Kate pointed out, there are 500, let's say, MEP EPDs that are out there. They may not be for, and likely will not be for North American products. And North America deals on a very different grid than somewhere like Sweden, where the numbers on the embodied carbon side are much lower because their grid is much cleaner. So you're not going to get that kind of true picture of what a North American product's impact is. But if you wanted to understand relative proportions of products against each other, you'd be able to do a whole building LCA. Will that tell you very much? No. So I think the advice of kind of using common sense rules of if one particular raw material is much more carbon intensive than another, and you have the option between aluminum and copper for your wiring, you can make that choice and you can make a better choice with one or the other. So I think just using common sense rules will likely help us to decrease carbon impacts. I think there was a comment in the chat about TM65, and I saw that Kate had mentioned that, but didn't talk about it ad nauseum. But there is a method that was produced by CIBSE, which is the UK's version of ASHRAE, to have these kind of raw material factors against different products, so that you could say my light is 90% aluminum and 10% copper. You'd be able to have these kind of scale factors. You scale up by complexity and you get a rough, very rough embodied carbon number. There's a version of that being worked on for North America to have those factors, and they're actually working with the car industry to get those factors for us. So ASHRAE in North America is working on the new TM65 for North America. That should be out in the summer of this year, I think. So that gives a good timeline for when we'll start to be able to do that with North American factors here. So in lieu of having an EPD, you have something to scale by. So I think these kind of incremental steps will help us come along much faster. Also, the IRA funding that's out there right now, I would highly encourage manufacturers to, I think the RFPs out, or for May 1st, I believe, is when they're looking for advice on how to spend the billions of dollars that were given for the Inflation Reduction Act. So I would just encourage manufacturers to use that funding to produce PCRs and EPDs.
Yeah, that's a great program to mention. And I don't know if you have anything you want to add about the TM65, since you initially brought that up, or if that kind of covers what you were.
Yeah, I was just adding in the chat. Sorry, I've been typing in the chat. The goal is to get that out by August. And I think it's on schedule. And yes, everything Kayleigh said was correct. I think that's, I put in there, I think TM65 is a really great rough first step to kind of estimate embodied carbon when an EPD is not available. And we've heard a couple of different ways that people are using TM65. So from a few different companies, I've heard, if they're looking to start to do EPDs, TM65 might be a great way to test out what the potential embodied carbon would be from a variety of products within a single company. And then you can say, okay, we might want to sort of use, that'll kind of help us set a target for where we want to start doing EPDs, for instance. So that's one great way that you can use TM65. And that embodied North American addendum. Yeah, keep your eye out for it. So in the fall. Yep.
That's great. Thanks so much, Kate. And Leela, do you have anything you wanted to add about TM65?
Yeah, I think that it is, as Chris has also been saying, and Kate, that it's a useful tool to kick off a cradle to gate measurement of the product before you're taking into account more of the complexity of use phase. one of the things that we had to think about when we were drafting language to update our spec sections was this hierarchy of data or reporting and what we would be asking for on a very large job, so 3.3 million square foot. And we decided that where there is significant commercial interest, that the data should be verified. And so with TM65 currently being more of an in-house tool for manufacturers and designers to get a glimpse of what is the impact of creating this product, that makes a lot of sense. We then had a preference for third-party verified data for the purposes of selecting one manufacturer over another, or our preferred 3 for the purposes of an actual project. Though I'd be very interested to see if we get to a point where, for example, TM65 could be verified, or there's a further step, or there's a tool that we accept is reliable enough, and that becomes something we're happy to use. One of the things that we did find from certain manufacturers who had been using TM65 and had done EPDs was that since it was developed as an MEP tool, it had a lot of different aspects that were not that relevant to lighting, and that certain multipliers or coefficients were giving different results. So there is already some, there's data that we could share, and happy to look at that more closely. That's the phase that we're in the incubator at the moment, is testing how the data run through these different platforms spits out something similar or not at all. Let's keep
That's
going.
really interesting perspectives. Thank you all. So we only have 5 or 6 minutes. So what I'd really like to end with is, what can we all be doing, to increase the knowledge and elevate this topic of embodied carbon, and what can we be doing to push this forward on our own projects? So I'd love to hear, sort of one little thing from each of you that everyone on the call today can really take back, share with their office, or sort of get the ball rolling. So Kayleigh, do you have anything for people to take away?
I would just encourage more conversations like this so that you become more familiar with the terms of reference in this space first. So I think sharing that with your office, so that's no longer a foreign topic. I think we're finally getting to the point where people do understand what embodied carbon is, I would hope, versus operational, but even things like that, you don't know what people don't know. So I would just say to continue to spread the terms of reference, and then slowly starting to get things into your spec language at your company. I think that's really helpful to even just engage manufacturers in the topic of talking about EPDs. The more pressure it doesn't matter if you're coming at it from 50 different directions, the more pressure we put on manufacturers, the more likely we are to get that data. So I think we're starting to see a response from manufacturers. So I would just encourage continuation of conversation.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. And the more of us that are asking for this, the more manufacturers know it's a group that can be really an impactful step. Suni, do you have anything through your work that you can share with us?
Yeah, again, I think everything that Kayleigh said. The only thing I might add is that advocacy within the public too, and on your products, if we're getting clients to start asking for this, it becomes an even bigger driver for not just the designers, but for the manufacturers to react. And I think that's a big part of it too. So like Kayleigh said, the more pressure from as many angles, the better.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And I believe the Carbon Leadership Forum and MEP 2040 both have outreach templates. Is that correct? So if you're looking for some prompts to start that conversation internally, or language when you're reaching out to reps and manufacturers, that might be a really great resource for people. And sorry, Suni, one more thing to put you on the spot, but through the education work, I believe there's also some 101 and 102 videos that you could share with your office if you're looking. For people who might not have that background.
The Carbon Leadership Forum put out a couple of series. Actually, the first is the sort of Carbon 101, and you can find those webinars both on the AIA's website, but I believe they're also available for free on the BSA's website if you didn't need credits. If you want credits, go to the AIA. And that covers the sort of basics of carbon, embodied carbon. And then there's another series called the Impact Series, and it sort of outlines how different organizations are trying to implement low carbon strategies on all of their projects.
Great, thank you. So Leela, you had mentioned spec language. That's a really great step that people, and I really appreciate you sharing the language you're using with everyone and being so transparent about that. That's a fantastic resource. Is there anything else that you think people can be taking back to their work today?
I think asking for time for people to actually skill up or participate in these progressive conversations is important. I think as designers, it's on us now to actually support manufacturers who are taking this step. So we should be putting them on jobs. We should be finding out who has the data and supporting them. And that also takes time, which none of us seem to have. And so there is this gap, I suppose, in billable hours thinking that needs to perhaps evolve a little bit too, that we have some professional development time to learn, and also that we start to create these, well, share the information more widely about who's actually on board. So it's less about pointing the finger at manufacturers and designers standing behind them and with them and supporting that demand.
Thanks so much, and I really appreciate you bringing that sort of collaborative aspect to that answer. So Kate, what would you suggest everyone can do today?
Yeah, well, I want to just back up everything that the other panelists said. I mean, I think I was going to mention, just finding the resources on the websites that we talked about today and making sure that, within your company that there are resources to actually go, learn more, right? Spend the time to learn more on, work time. Those are the two things that I had in my head. But I also was going to say, I've just and I do totally think it's really important to include the spec language, and I just from the other perspective, we have manufacturers that we're working with that are like very far along and like have all the data collected and are getting requests through reps or from clients saying, we need an LCA. And, they're like, we are like at the forefront of collecting LCA information for North America, and we don't have it. And, we don't have that. So I get like that it's really frustrating. It can be frustrating from the manufacturer perspective to be sort of bombarded with this language, like we need it now, and it takes time. It does take time, but I know that there's a lot of companies that are working on this. And so I think it is good to just kind of have that idea in your head, to what Leela said, that we do need to work together. So we should keep asking for this information, but just, be aware that it takes time and resources to collect it. And, manufacturers are in the same boat, right? Like they need to put somebody on this and like spend many hours and, resources to get the data. So it'll take time, but people are working on it.
That's great. And Kate, not to put you too much on the spot, but before we wrap up in the last minute, someone asked a question in the chat about the difference between an EPD and a declare label. And for everyone who's not checking the chat, I think that's a really important distinction. And Kate, you had a great reply, but I wondered if you could just give us your 2 sentences. I think that's sort of too important to just have it in the chat in this conversation.
Yeah, I think so, declare or HPD are both material focused. And I've heard that declare is maybe pulling in some more information that's related to embodied carbon, which would be great. But at the moment, to my understanding, both declare and HPD are declarations of material. So, you're talking about what materials are in the product to like 1,000 parts per million, very detailed on the materials. And EPD is a life cycle assessment. So that's beyond material. It includes materials, but it also looks at all of the inputs and the outputs that go into the production and manufacturing and use and disposal and end of life of a product or a material or a building, or, we are applying LCAs to installations at the city scale, right? So you're like really looking comprehensively across the life cycle and also at a variety of life cycle impacts. So that's embodied carbon, eutrophication, water, human health potential. So there's a variety of impacts that you also look at, and it comes out in a very comprehensive report. So there's a big difference, but there's of course overlap, right?
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for everyone who's joined us today and has spent their lunch hour learning about embodied carbon and sustainability in lighting. I truly appreciate it. And I so appreciate all the panelists for giving their time to our section to share their knowledge on this topic. There's some links in the chat, so if you're able to take a look at those, that's great. But thank you all so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah.
Thanks, Alexandra.
Yeah.